Welcome to another edition of Simons Says, a podcast devoted to conversationalists and the curious-minded. Here's your host, me, the follically challenged Dave Simons, certified financial planner and all-around nice guy. Hello again, everybody. I was first introduced to the wacky and wild world of economics when I first went to Mizzou, more than 40 years ago. Man, that's hard to say now. It's amazing. But it was an Econ 101 class. And it was taught by a very legendary professor at Mizzou by the name of Walter Johnson. And Professor Johnson was famous, or in some cases, some people's eyes, infamous, depending on where you were coming at the world of economics. But he was sort of an eccentric, funny guy. He was a thin-railed man, but full of a lot of energy and passion for something that some people would see as, watching paint dry, and that is economics. But he did make it come alive. Now, I wasn't majoring in that at the time, and I did okay with it. But what fascinated me were the people who were majoring in that kind of thing. And I thought, that's a really interesting industry. If you think about it for a second, if you're an economist, you take in all of this data. Now, the data seems to be black and white. It's like 2 + 2 = 4. Here's the unemployment rate. But is it? Because there are a couple of different surveys. Well, here's the inflation rate. Yeah, but inflation with these products is here, and a certain percentage of Americans buy them more than others. So it's this inexact science, and yet economists have to take this data and mine for nuggets of information and extrapolate somehow where the economy and the financial markets may be heading. And they routinely get it wrong, and yet we always come back to them and say the majority of economists believe this. Now, I am not trying to be derisive towards economists. Again, these are very, very smart people, and they have a tough job. But let's be honest. It's almost like trying to predict the wind a quarter from now. We feel the wind. We know it's there. But how in the world can you make a forecast of what the wind is going to be doing 3 months from now? Well, you look at history and you say, well, typically in July or August, here in the St. Louis, Missouri area, the wind is doing this. That's what history. And we also look at the seasonality. And we're looking now at global weather patterns that are developing right now and what that may do. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. That's very highly intelligent people looking at these models. But to try to come up with something, what that means down the road is where you get this vast array of different opinions. And that's where economists set themselves apart. The top economists will start to make a name for themselves. And that includes the special guest that I have on this week's Simon Says podcast. Brian Wesbury is his name. He's been the chief economist at First Trust for a while. First Trust Advisors, First Trust Portfolios, we'll just refer to it as First Trust. And in full disclosure, we do use some of the ETFs or exchange-traded funds through First Trust. But Brian Wesbury not only has appeared multiple times on all the major financial cable shows like CNBC, Fox Business, Bloomberg. He's been quoted in all the well-known financial publications, but he's also been given a number of highly acclaimed awards. He's been named one of the top 10 economic forecasters by USA Today. One year, he was the #1 economic forecaster as labeled by the Wall Street Journal. So this guy has some street cred. And interestingly, I talked about Mizzou. There's also a Mizzou connection with Brian Wesbury, as he'll explain. So I think this is a very fascinating field. Trying to follow what economists have to say. And again, it takes a lot of years of experience to find out who really seems to be, who's kind of got the it factor, who seems to kind of know what's going on more than his or her colleagues. And I would put Brian Wesbury definitely in that group. So here we go, my interview that I just recently did with Mr. Wesbury. All right, without further ado, let's get right to it. And my special guest on the Simon Says podcast today is the chief economist at First Trust, Brian Wesbury. Brian, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Great to be with you.
Thanks for taking time out. You are in town in St. Louis because you do a lot of traveling, I know.
Yep.
But shortly after this, you're going to go address hundreds of advisors. You have done this quite a bit. You getting tired of this travel and this business? Or are you still loving it?
You know, we have a young wholesaler at First Trust asked me the other day, "Are you burned out?" And I'm like, "I burned out 25 years ago." I mean, I have been flying 150, 200,000 miles a year for over 20 years. And this year we will do 130 of these meetings. St. Louis happens to be one of the biggest ones. For some reason, Minneapolis, Columbus, Ohio, and St. Louis, we get 300 to 400 people, financial advisors that come hear our spiel, our speeches, what we're thinking about the economy today. And so, yeah, we travel. We'll do 4 of them this week. Last week we did 7. So
wow, and this is sort of a homecoming for you in a way. You went to high school just down the highway.
Yeah,
Tell
I
us
did.
about that.
So in 8th grade, I moved from my dad got his PhD at the University of Florida. And then we moved to Columbia, Missouri, where he was a professor at Mizzou, and I started school there, and then went to Rockbridge High School. I was the first graduating class that went all 3 years at Rockbridge. So it was a brand new school. They pulled kids from Hickman, from University High. And I happened to be a sophomore, and it was a brand new school. So it was. I grew up with Columbia. I mean, back then Columbia was only 40,000 people, and now it's well over 100. I still have 2 brothers and their wives, and all kinds of nieces and nephews that live in Columbia. So I get back a few times a year.
Very nice. And you stayed for at least 1 year into college, didn't you? Go to Mizzou
I did.
briefly?
I was going to be an engineer, specifically an industrial engineer, which is mathematics. It's really just applied math. Like, how does United keep all its planes in the right place, even though they don't very often?
They needed you.
Yeah, how does UPS route trucks to most efficiently use fuel, et cetera, et cetera? That's the kind of thing that industrial engineers designed. And I was really good at math, and I loved it. But then they made me take biology and chemistry, and I'm like, no, I don't want. So I changed to a math major, and then in the midst of all of that, I was a rock climber, believe it or not. So we would climb on the bluffs on the Missouri River, and there were a few places to climb around Columbia, and then I would go to Colorado every summer. I still can't believe my parents. It was a different day. I would get on a Greyhound bus and go rock climbing with people I didn't even know. And then I met a bunch of people, and one of them went to Missoula, Montana, the University of Montana. So I actually changed schools. I was a townie, right? And all my friends were staying at Mizzou, and then I realized, well, I made 2 mistakes. Number 1, industrial engineering. I had to take chemistry and biology. And then number 2, I really wanted to be in the mountains. And so I went to the University of Montana, and that's where I graduated from.
Interesting. So it wasn't some educational pull that Montana, no, it was the outdoors and the rocks and all that got you out there.
Exactly. And I quit climbing. I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever done a sport like that, but you're immortal. Like, you have to think you're immortal. And then all of a sudden I became mortal, and I quit. But my roommate, my first roommate at the University of Montana, was a fly fisherman from New Hampshire. And I learned how to tie flies and fly fish, and now it's a lifelong hobby, and it's my passion.
So Brian, where did the economics part of this come in? Are you in Montana still looking at math at the time?
I was a math major, like just crushing it on math, and I was I wasn't going to win the Nobel Prize or anything, but I was good at it. And then I finally kind of sat back one day and said, what am I going to do with this? I don't want to stand in front of a blackboard. I like people. And I took a class in economics and absolutely fell in love with it. And econ
You're the
takes
one.
a lot of math.
I didn't know many people fell in love with economics.
I
right
did,
away.
and it's
Wow.
all I ever wanted to do.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's so I changed because I didn't want to stand in front of a blackboard. I love people. And then I fell in love with economics, and I'm like, this is a great way to get involved in the world, how the world works. Really, I kind of think back to being a kid and, 19, 20-year-old kid. And maybe if I would have taken geology or some medical course, because I love systems, so if and maybe that was the engineering thing too, but if you push on that, this moves. If you move that, this pressure goes up. And economics was a system. And the professor I had was so good at explaining it, I just fell in love with it. And I'm like, and it impacts people and life and the whole world. And this is really kind of fun. Now, little did I know 40 years later that I would have been in the White House and been on TV and doing speeches all over the country. Little did I know. I had no idea where it was going to go, but I loved it.
Well, speaking of the White House and in D.C., if I remember your bio correctly, you kind of had a government job for a while, didn't you? Maybe back in the 90s. Tell us about that.
I did. So I graduated in 1982. The unemployment rate was still over 10%. In Montana, it was 20%.
Wow.
You couldn't even. My joke is they had to steal a teller's job at a bank. Like that was the only way you were going to get into finance in Montana. And so I looked at Denver, and I was good at math. I could have been an actuary, and I had a couple of offers, but I didn't. I wanted economics, so I moved to Chicago. My parents had moved there. I was one of the kids that moved into the basement. And tried. I went down to every bank in Chicago, and there were still economics departments from the 70s back there. They were pretty big, and I got lucky. I really got lucky. So I started my career at Harris Bank, and then I moved to a bond firm, Griffin, Cubic, Stevens and Thompson. And then I remember a really good friend of mine, Stephen Moore. And if you watch Fox News, you see Steve all the time.
Moore.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
okay.
I know. He needed my help getting a room at the top of the Sears Tower, because that's where our offices were. There's a club up there. To have PJ O'Rourke's birthday. And we pile in the elevator to go 100 floors up. And on the way up, I'm like, hey, the Republicans just won. Newt Gingrich is going to take over. What are you going to do? What job are you taking? And he goes, the question isn't about me. It's about you. What do you want to do? And I'm like, oh, come on. I didn't even think. And then I thought about it for a couple of days, and I decided to write either, one letter or send one fax or make one phone call a day. And I'll just test the waters. Well, the first time I picked up the phone, called a friend of mine, Bob Motice, who was the legislative director for Connie Mack, senator from Florida. Turns out he was taking over the Joint Economic Committee. And Bob, he said, I can't believe you're calling me. You want to come? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, get your butt out here. We're going to interview for the chief economist of the Joint Economic Committee's job. And I got it. And so for 2 years, I lived in D.C., and I was the chief economist of the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress.
So what does that role mean exactly? What primarily is the responsibility?
Yeah. So the formation of this committee goes back to the 70s, when the president wanted his own Council of Economic Advisors, and the Congress said, "Okay, we'll give you that funding if you give us our own Joint Economic Committee." And the joint means it's between the Senate and the House. So we had members from both, and Connie Mack happened to be the chairman. And so the first thing that happened, I moved there January 2nd, 1995, and saw Newt Gingrich take the gavel in the House chamber. All of that was really cool. But the Mexican peso exploded. And
Oh, I
so
remember. Yeah.
I all I did for 3 days was brief senators and congressmen on what this meant and what we ought to do about it. And so we dealt with things like that. We wrote legislation. We were the committee whenever the employment report came out, which is once a month. We would have the hearing about job growth in America every first Friday of every month. They still do it to this day, and we would have to write opening statements, develop questions for the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and so we did all that. We also were the committee that had the hearings with Alan Greenspan. So twice a year they call them Humphrey Hawkins hearings, which they've kind of gotten rid of now, but we would have this. So I ended up knowing Alan Greenspan really well, the White House, all the economists all over government. I met people at the Wall Street Journal, on TV. It was it was an amazing launch pad for my career. And I tell people, like, if you can avoid Washington, D.C., do it. But if you do go there, don't stay long and never go back.
Yeah.
And so that
Good
I stayed
advice.
about 2 years. And
Yeah.
one funny story about that, I used to do lunchtime business radio in Chicago on a 50,000 watt station, WBBM. Len Walters was the business reporter, and he goes, Brian, before you went to Washington, you would answer me in sentences. Now you've been there and you come back and you answer me in paragraphs. You're no good for radio anymore.
That's perfect. And the way that you're describing your background, it's all making sense to me. The talent that I see that you have and those weekly missives that you write, the Monday Morning Outlook, which, by the way, I absolutely love. But your mathematics background,
Right.
you talk about systems. And I never thought about this before, but I think that would really play well in the world of economics.
Right.
And then your role in DC probably helped you then articulate what can be very complex systems, complex issues, which you use in your outlook. And that leads me to the next question about being an economist.
Right.
A lot of people would look at what you do and say, well, they're like meteorologists. They'll get it right most of the time,
Right.
or a baseball player who fails 7 out of 10 times is in a Hall of Famer.
Right.
When did it dawn on you when you started to get into your career that, you know what, this is such an inexact science. I can look at the data,
Right.
and I know what the data tells me, but it doesn't mean a hill of beans for me to be able to extract something from that and predict where the economy is going. I think a lot of people would fail out because of that, because it would drive them crazy.
Right.
But you seem to thrive in that environment.
I do. And I think a lot of it has to do with having the right model, the system, the understanding the system, the way the world works. Jude Wanniski, who was the editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page back in the late 70s, early 80s, he wrote a book called The Way the World Works. And I got really lucky because my first job at the Harris Bank in Chicago was with an economist. The chief economist at the time was Bob Janetsky. Now, he used to work for a guy named Burl Sprinkle, who was the chief economist of the Harris Bank for all of the 60s and 70s, really, who Reagan hired to come be his head of the Council of Economic Advisors. And so within 3 months of me starting at the Harris Bank, I had met Burl Sprinkle. I had met Larry Kudlow. I had met Jude Wanniski, Alan Reynolds, Arthur Laffer. Steve was younger, Steve Moore, who became, he and I were kind of the same age, and they pulled us in because we could do it and we understood it. But that's how I learned the system. And then the second thing is one of the things that was happening at that time is all these banks had built up these big economic departments, and they were shrinking because it was a tough time in the economy, and we're a cost center. We're not generating revenue, and we closed our library down, and I picked up a bunch of books out of there, and one of them was The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, and it changed my life. And then I moved from Hayek on to Mises, and so my growth in economics is really twofold. Number one, meeting the right people, reading them, learning from them. Number two, having the intellectual curiosity to read and then study with others. There were a few groups, and I won't go into all the details, but we would read books together in Chicago. A lot of these traders from the Chicago Board of Trade, a lot of those people are really intellectual, and so we would read books together. And so I grew on two tracks. I really was self-educated. I did go to Northwestern and got my MBA, but they didn't teach Hayek and Friedman and Mises. But I grew that way, and then I grew because of the people I met.
So it's interesting you mentioned some of these well-known economists. A lot of people will ascribe political affiliations.
Right.
Well, are you a Keynesian? Do you follow Milton Friedman?
Right.
Following you for a while, it's very clear that you are more on the conservative thinking side of things. Yep. Small government, keep taxes low, and I'm simplifying, of course. On the other side, I'll kind of juxtapose that with like a Paul Krugman, who's well known for being on the left side.
Right.
He doesn't mind that. He wears that as a badge. He's proud of that. Do you purposely on your side say, yes, I believe on the conservative side of things, or is that just kind of a natural flow and, hey, this is what I believe and I'm not trying to be political? Address that.
Right. I think as an economist, you have to, there was this book written, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And I don't mean to make this a difference between men and women. That's not what it is. It's the difference between how you look at the world. Right. So there's two kinds of economists, really. Supply-siders, which I would consider myself a supply-sider, and then demand-siders. And demand-siders, let's just go there first, believe, for example, I saw the Treasury Secretary one time gosh, I'm blanking on his name, but he used to run a railroad. And he said, trains, we're full when we have 100 cars. And right now it's only about 72 on average, and we need to get back to 100. Like, we need to boost demand for goods so that we're now having 100-car trains, and that's when the economy's really going. So when people are buying stuff, then we have to buy more rail cars, and we fill more rail cars, and we haul more rail cars, and we sell more. The whole economy grows because of demand. So we need to give money to people to have them spend. And the supply sider will look at that and go, that's not where growth comes from. I mean, if we think back to, thousands of years, we invented the wheel. Well, think about how much more productive. That didn't come from demand. That came from somebody inventing the wheel. We did not have people marching around in the parking lots of of shopping malls with signs going, we want fax machines, we want cell phones, because they didn't even know what they were. Yeah. And so what a supply sider says is, no, wealth, growth, it doesn't come from people spending money. It comes from people inventing better ways of doing things. And like, if you think about it, we invented, when we first invented the cell phone, nobody knew that anybody really wanted one. Like, why would you want to be on the phone in the car? Or, there are quotes of people like, why would people want a computer on their desk? Like, the mainframe down in the basement is just fine. And now we all have computers in our hands. And so there's people that fight progress all the time, but that's where wealth comes from. And it's entrepreneurship. I consider entrepreneurs angels. They are literally able to look at the world. Here's the pieces that are out there, and put them together in a different way than has ever been done before. And we have a perfect example of that going on today, and that would be Elon Musk. Well, we could talk about Tesla, we could talk about other things, but SpaceX, they are now putting up, because they've learned how to land those boosters, which is 70% of the cost of a rocket shot, and save them and use them again dozens of times. They have lowered the cost of launching a rocket and putting payload in space to $3 to $5 million a launch, down from the space shuttle, which was $1 billion a launch. That's what creates wealth over time. We invented, go back far enough, we invented boats and fishing nets, and that was way better than standing out there and trying to get them with a spear. And so that's where growth and wealth come from. And so that's why I'm a supply sider, because I've studied that a lot. I've thought about that a lot. I've looked at history a lot. And then the final point I would make is that the United States is astounding. And if you look at all the history of the world, if you were born in 500, AD, and you look at somebody that lived in 1700 AD, their life wasn't that much different.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, it just changed. And it was the Magna Carta in the UK mattered because it gave the king less power and people more. But we took the Magna Carta with the Constitution and made it even better. The word right, actual right, is only shows up once in the Constitution. And what it says is that inventors and writers have the right of ownership of what they produced, and that's the fuel. That's the fire of interest to the fuel of the fuel of interest to the fire of invention. In other words, that's what allowed us to be so inventive, and that's why we stand out in all the history of the world. America is truly the black swan. People always talk about it's really a white swan, I guess you would call it, because it's good. But if you look at all the history of mankind, we're so different than for thousands of years that it's pretty clear that something different happened here. And I think if you just look at that pretty closely, you see why. It's because of the supply side.
Yeah, and you talk so eloquently about the difference between government getting involved in things, and government has its role in certain things, of course, and the free market capitalistic, the entrepreneurial ability and innovation that humans have, the ingenuity, and if we could just give the freedom for that, that's where economic growth comes. And you talk about America being, whether it's black swan, white swan, whatever, we are different. So with that said, are you fearful about the direction that we are heading now, whether it's the debt that continues to hit record highs, the government getting more active, the Fed is a lot more active. That's probably a different subject matter. Are you still an optimist, I guess is what I'm getting at, or do you have worries and fears about where this country is heading?
I guess I'm still an optimist in the long run for just one simple reason. There's this de Tocqueville wrote about it. Others have written about it. They say democracies only last 200 years, and then it's over. And we just cave in on ourselves. Or there's all kinds of different analyses of why it ends. And my argument back is, but there's only one U.S. Constitution. And that hasn't failed yet. So you can tell me Rome failed or Greece failed or the UK lost its reserve currency status or something, but none of them had the U.S. Constitution. And I still think that document is robust enough to survive and allow us to thrive. Having said that, and let me just go back to what you just said, we have supply siders, we have demand siders, but if you think about the distribution of resources, so a capitalist system distributes resources, and people always call it greed or something, but those who are productive with resources, they take a dollar, a pound of coal, and they make it into more than that, more than people that generate returns on resources gather more. It's the way the world, and people want to invest in them. It's just they gather more. This is why Elon Musk is worth over $200 billion, because he takes things and makes more out of them. People that are not productive lose resources. And oftentimes they want to, we either feel like we got blessed with all of this, but no, it's really about being productive, or somebody stole it from, and no, it's about being less productive. Well, that's the way the capitalist system works. The more, I don't want to call what we have socialism, but the government run system uses power to distribute resources. Mm-hmm. So they, for whatever reason, we're going to take from the rich, give to the poor. We're going to take from one race and give to another race. We believe in solar and wind and not fossil fuels. So we're going to punish fossil fuels and subsidize and so government works by coercion almost, whereas the capitalist system works by providing a great product, whether it's a good or a service, for a good price, and it's all done voluntarily. Whereas government, they use the force of law to get people to behave a certain way, and so that's why I would argue it's not just supply side. It comes from invention, but it also comes from the capitalist system itself. And so those two things work together. Today, and this is my worry, if you add up federal, state, and local government spending and also the cost of regulation, and I always use two examples. One, think about how much time you spend doing your taxes, or how much you pay somebody to do them. If you're a landscaper, the second is if you're a landscaper and you have a weed killer in your truck, you know how much paperwork you have to have just to comply. If you know how many inspections you have to build a house, it's like the cost. So federal, state, and local government spending plus the cost of all the regulations. Right now, our governments in the U.S. of all levels take up 50% of what we produce. We have never been this big. And if you want to compare this to something, it would be Europe. It would be France, Italy, Spain. All of them have had higher unemployment than us for decades, slower growth than us, and they don't have Apples and Googles and Teslas and SpaceXs. We do. And we're number one, we're number 4, we're number 10 in technology. And so to me, it's really evident that the freer you are, the more you respect the rule of law, and you allow the capitalist system to operate, the wealthier you will become. And what bothers me today is that by trying to redistribute this much, we're actually harming our growth. Just think about what we did during COVID. One of the things we said about COVID is it hurts certain communities more than others. It's the affliction damages this group, and this group wins because they have better health care, they have more money, whatever all the reasons are. And so we were going to, fix this inequality. Well, by printing all this money and borrowing and paying people not to work, all we did was flood the system with cash. We created inflation. If you own assets, stocks, a house, you win. If you don't own assets, you lost. We actually made inequality worse by trying to fix it. And that's why I'm a huge believer in capitalism, because it does the opposite.
I was going to say, if Elizabeth Warren was sitting right next to me, by the way, that would be an interesting podcast. I'll try to set that up. But I think of her because she just happened to be on CNBC this morning. She would hear what you're saying and say, Brian, you're wrong. It's the capitalistic system that has set up this bifurcated society that we have. The rich are getting richer.
Right.
They don't care about the poor. And so even the middle class is starting to sink down. And so we need more government
Right.
action to try to lessen that gap. You would say, no, it's your policies
Right.
that have created that.
It's making it much worse. And in 1930, federal government spending without defense, so we're looking at the underlying government, was 2.5% of GDP. Today, it's 25% of GDP. And I told you, if we add federal, state, and local, plus the cost of regulations, it's 50% of all our output. Everything we produce, the government then uses one way or another. They take, they either borrow it because we have running huge deficits, or they tax it and then they spend it. And what's happened everywhere I go, people are talking about affordable housing and inequality, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. If government fixes all these problems, and government's never been bigger, shouldn't the problems be less, not more? And so I think it's pretty simple. I'll just address affordable housing. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. People can't afford houses. Well, there's two reasons. Number one, yes, house prices have gone up, but if incomes had gone up more, houses would be more affordable, not less.
Right.
So in reality, it's a two-part problem. It's not just the cost of housing, which everybody seems to isolate. It's how much you're taking home. And if the government's taking half of everything we produce, no wonder houses are less affordable.
Yeah, right. So we need to wrap it up because you are a busy man. But I before you leave, I just have to ask you, and you can give a brief answer on this. You did not join the original cry for recession when we first started to hear it back in 22. The markets were not doing well. You hadn't jumped on that bandwagon.
Right.
And as it turned, you were right, as it turns out. You, just as some of these same economists were starting to pull back from that call last year, you then went to the other side and said, no, I think we are going to have a recession at some point.
Right.
Do you still believe that?
Yeah, it's interesting, and people always try to figure out whether I'm a contrarian but I'm not. I'm just I look at the data. So here's the way I think about it. COVID was a car wreck. And the reason I was optimistic, COVID, we went straight down. Everything fell because we locked the economy down. Nobody had ever done this before. We were scared out of our minds, and everything went down. But we pumped all that money in the economy, borrowed all that money. I'm like, it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. We're going to come rocketing out of here, and that's what happened. Well, so we had a car wreck. We broke our leg in 4 places. That's what I sort of think COVID is. We turned a switch off on the economy. And then everybody thinks like nothing bad happened. But that's because the ambulance showed up and pumped us full of morphine. Well, eventually the morphine has to wear off. And my belief is that we're in that process right now. Just today, and I know we've been talking really big picture, but we've had some today. Retail sales were really bad. Right. They're down in this year so far, especially adjusted for inflation. And there are other signs. Industrial production, depending on which measure you look at, hasn't been doing well. Initial unemployment claims, and the job market is slowing down. Anything in this environment is a risky call because we've never done the things that we've done. Government's never been this big. Technology has never been as amazing. So it's always this balance. Big government on one hand, and the morphine wearing off is a negative. On the other hand, AI and these new weight loss drugs that make people healthier, and SpaceX and Starlink and all these new technologies are really powerful, and that's the model. And by the way, it's not. There is math, and there is a model, but some of it's art. Like, how much will this raise productivity? And is it enough to overcome the damage of all this debt? And that's where I think some people just look at the debt and go, that's it, we're done for. And then other people look at the technology and go, that's it, we're going to the moon. And I think it's somewhere in between.
And we're always smarter 10 years from now. We always say, well, everyone could have seen that. No, you couldn't have seen it.
Exactly.
So, Brian Wesbury, Chief Economist at First Trust, thank you for your time.
Dave, thank you.
Appreciate it very much. And we'll talk to you again on another Simon Says podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening, and please forward the link to this podcast to friends, family, neighbors, even strangers. They'll thank you later. If you'd like more information on our wealth management team, just go to your search engine and type in Simons and Cordis, SIMONS and CORDES, Simons and Cordis, and the website will be the first thing that pops up. I'll talk to you again soon on the next episode of the Simon Says podcast.